Hello and welcome. You're watching Big Picture with me, VISHAL, DAHIYA, and today we're going to talk about the new rules and regulations for social media platforms, their implications, and the importance therein as well. Remember, on 25th of February, the government of India had put in place a set of rules, guidelines, in fact, for all the social media intermediaries. They had to comply with all those guidelines within the time frame of 3 months. Now that time limit will get over, and we'll try and understand not only what these guidelines are and their importance, but also their implications. Why do we need them, and where does these social media platforms stand when we're talking about compliance with these guidelines? And for more on this, we're joined by two distinguished experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Mr. Abhishek Singh. He is the CEO of MyGov platform and National E-Governance Division in the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. We also have with us Advocate Anuj Agarwal, cyber law expert. Welcome, both of you, gentlemen. Let me begin with you, Abhishek ji. Let's start by understanding those set of guidelines which have been put in place by the government for these social media platforms. What is it that the government wants them to comply with?
See, the government had notified the intermediary guidelines a few months back after extensive consultations, after huge demand from people with regard to the harassment and with regard to the stuff that goes on social media. There is a huge request from various people, like people morph pictures, people try to spoil the reputation of women especially, and all kinds of child pornography and other stuff is also posted. And there sometimes some posts are made which can lead to a serious law and order issue also. In this regard, government had notified around 3 months back the intermediary guidelines, which said that, which called upon all intermediaries, the social media platforms that we typically know of, which includes Instagram, which includes Twitter, which includes Facebook, which includes Google, YouTube. So all of them to comply with these guidelines. And what it does is that it asks them something very basic, which is like having a grievance redressal mechanism. So that in case you have a grievance against anything that is posted, which is predatory or which is causing any challenge to public order, then that complaint somebody will be able to lodge to the grievance redressal officer. And it requires that the grievance redressal officer will be notified by name and his contact details. He will be required to acknowledge such complaint within 24 hours and resolve it within 15 days. And in case in a special category, whenever the complaint concerns a woman, or whenever it concerns a crime which is being committed, or anything that relates to women, there the obligation is to resolve that complaint within 24 hours. Or if there is any page, any depiction which has been done, that has to be removed within 24 hours. Then it also calls upon two categories of social media intermediaries. There is one is a regular social media intermediary, and then there is a significant social media intermediary. Significant social media intermediaries will be those which will be defined having a larger number of followers or larger number of subscribers compared to the usual ones. That number, I think, has been fixed to those platforms who have more than 5 million subscribers. They fall in the category of significant social media intermediaries. And they are required to follow certain other norms, which include like appointing a chief compliance officer who should be a resident in India, appointing a node contact officer who should be available 24/7, who should be a resident of India, and then a resident grievance officer. A resident grievance officer who should also be a resident of India. These compliances has to be met, and then they are also supposed to file a monthly report with regard to the number of complaints received and number of action that has been taken. And then there are other provisions which require that platform should have a voluntary verification mechanism, wherein like Twitter very often follows a blue tick mechanism. So there will be a mechanism to verify users. Then there should be an opportunity to for users to be heard whenever any content that they post is removed. Then there is, if there is any unlawful information or any fake news, anything that is posted on the platform, if there is a court or if there is a competent authority which directs them to remove them, then they are supposed to action on them, take action on them. So these are very simple compliance guidelines which is required for ensuring that the social media remains a source of information, remains a source of healthy information exchange, and works in a constructive, positive, creative manner rather than causing any distress to the society.
Okay, fair enough. And that sums up what exactly is that these social media intermediaries do have to follow in terms of the guidelines out there. Let me bring in, Advocate Anuj Agarwal here as well. Mr. Agarwal, let's look at it from the legal point of view here as well, because if we have to look at, cyber laws which are there within our country, where does these guidelines fit in that framework? That's one. And two, how important and significant are these guidelines? Because these guidelines, as Mr. Singh was pointing out, they tend to go ahead and deal with the problems which are faced by the social media users almost on a daily basis on almost all platforms.
Yeah, see, the genesis of this entire exercise lies in the writ petition, suo motu writ petition, Prajula case, which is already known in 2018. And that was a time when Honorable Supreme Court was really worried that about the child pornography, rape and gang rape videos, imaginaries, and things like being very much prevalent on the social media platforms. And they have called even Microsoft and Google also to present their views in the court, etc., etc. And then they directed the government to have suitable rules put in place to avoid these kind of things being repeated. Later on, it was also found out that social media had been extensively used, or at least claimed to be used, for organizing some kind of rioting. Especially this year also, on 26th January, there was a huge problem which has happened in the capital, and the social media was used to aggravate all such problems. Keeping that in mind, and the scope of the social media these days, where the access is very much there, each and every person is getting information and is able to post information, and there is absolutely no mechanism from these platforms to really check whether the information which is being provided, posted, has any basis, whether it is correct, whether it is inflammatory in nature. I mean, there is absolutely no control. So keeping all that in mind, I think the government, through the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, by amendment or completely replacing the intermediaries rules, brought out these guidelines to at least bring in some sort of a self-governance. I will still not call these guidelines as something which even the government has kept much of the power with themselves for the enforcement. There is hardly any power they have kept. What they have actually brought these guidelines to help these platforms to become more of a self-governing platforms, to at least have some responsibility, accept some responsibility. But what is happening, unfortunately, is that those very mild suggestions which the ministry has given, they are not complying, and probably they are taking some sort of a confrontist stance. Keeping in mind that so far the government's stand on most of the issues as far as the media is concerned has been very lenient, and I think this is also keeping in mind our tradition of democracy and freedom of speech. It is there, but I think time has come, since these social media platforms which are having users up to 50 crore and reach as wide as any rural area, hinterland, young, old, everybody is having the access. It is time that these guidelines are made in such a manner that these platforms can be held accountable and even criminally accountable.
I'm saying that, as Advocate Agarwal is pointing out, this is about putting in place an accountability mechanism. And as Mr. Singh was also earlier talking about the guidelines, Mr. Singh, I'd like to come back to you and then try and understand the compliance part here. As Advocate Agarwal is saying, where do we stand in terms of the compliance by these social media platforms? Because the deadline gets over on 26th of May, and this is something which can be easily termed as a self-regulatory mechanism, these guidelines.
See, these are, you can call it self-regulatory guidelines, but then there is a lot of, they come from, they have been notified in the IT rules, and Section 87T2 of the IT Act also prescribes certain requirements from these platforms. And then there are some exemption clauses which are given to these platforms. Like if like way back when there was a issue with regard to whether they are platforms or whether they are publishers, then at that point of time, because they claimed that long back there was a case in which I think some pornographic clip was peddled on an e-commerce platform. And that point of time, this issue had come up whether they are platforms or whether they are publishers. And many of these platforms had taken the plea that since they just allow users to post content, the platforms cannot be held liable. So these exemptions are there. But if there are certain guidelines which the government has asked them, and the guidelines relate to complying with the grievance officer and having a compliance officer, then they would need to follow that, because then if they don't, then there are other provisions under which they function. They will come into play and they would be made to be liable for non-compliance of those portions of the IT Act.
Okay, so the implications for non-compliance by these social media platforms are also pretty much in place, and might kick in if they do not, agree to follow these guidelines by 26th May. Is that what you're saying, Mr. Singh?
Having said that, yeah, of course, whenever there are guidelines and whenever there are rules, whenever there are norms which are prescribed by the government or the competent authority, one is expected to comply with that. And these platforms comply with all such regulations everywhere in the world, and they have always indicated that they would comply. There is no reason that any such platform would not comply with that. And I don't think any one of them has kind of given a representation with regard to their refusal to comply. There might be issues in which they would want some more time or something, from what I have read in the media reports, because hiring people of Indian origin to be a chief compliance officer and all, sometimes they may take some time. That is a different issue, but I don't think there is any intent of any platform to not comply with these orders. And if India is a sovereign country, India is the biggest market for these companies. So if anybody is wanting to not comply and shut down business in India, that would be possible, but that would be very illogical, and I would not expect any such platform to do that. And from what I have heard, from what I have known, all of them will ensure compliance as the guidelines require them to.
Okay. Let's now shift focus towards the importance or the significance of these guidelines vis-a-vis the users. Earlier, you're listing out the guidelines, Mr. Singh, in your first response, and I'd like to start with you, Advocate Agarwal. From the legal point of view as well, it becomes really important to protect the user, the end user on these platforms. These, intermediaries, social media intermediaries are big companies, but the user are spread far and wide across the country, somebody in the rural internet, some young boy, some old man maybe. What are the rights and, responsibilities vis-a-vis the user in terms of the social media platforms here, and how they're taken care of by these guidelines and set of rules which are now kicking in?
See, there are two aspects to this. One is the positive aspect that, as you rightly mentioned, that this is being used by young and old across the country, people who are at a disadvantage living in the rural areas. So for them to look at achieving the constitutional objectives of justice, equality, liberty, these platforms are really a boon. So that is one part, and that is how they are so far enjoying so much of liberty. But I think if we look at from the legal perspective, as Mr. Singh mentioned about that Baji.com case, under which somebody uploaded a pornographic clip on Baji.com, which was an auction site, and there was a legal case in which the managing director of that company at that time was arrested and all that. And after that, there was a safe harbor clause in the name of intermediaries were given under Section 79 of the IT Act, that on an intermediary platform, if somebody is uploading an objectionable material, say for sale, purchase, why punish the intermediary? So if there are the similar is that if there are two cars colliding on a highway, and highway operator cannot be prosecuted because it is not his responsibility to ensure everything a car driver is doing. But I think the case of these social media companies are different. Legally speaking, they are actually not intermediaries. The government has been very kind to give them a special social media intermediary definition by the rules. But if you look at the law, the IT Act, the definition of intermediaries in 2W does not include social media companies, because these are basically publishing companies. They are not selling anything. They are letting people bring out their ideas or publish a news which is otherwise already published. So I can put a cutting of Times of India in one of my tweets, or I can write my own views, or I can write something as a news bringing, saying, okay, that has happened, which may be correct or not correct. So they are basically publishers. So they should be treated like that only. But so far, because for some reason the government has been allowing, and I think, as I mentioned to you also, that since they were letting our citizens speak up and getting some constitutional liberties being bestowed upon these people, so government had been kind. But that should now change, because these platforms are using them not only for money making but for curated content. So today, if I am speaking certain content which may be true but may not be of the liking of the platform, they are changing it. Well, an editor of a newspaper definitely has a right to see that the contents which are being published on the newspaper is as per their standards or government standards. But then they should also be liable to the government of the country. So today what they are saying, that they are a government on their own, they are not following any local government, the government of India regulations, they are not following. So I think legal framework is that they should now be registered as newspapers, as publishers, and regulated accordingly.
Okay, Mr. Singh, do you agree with that? A way of looking at this is an entire issue, because as Advocate Agarwal is pointing out, he says times come for these social media platforms to be shifted from the intermediaries to the publishers category. That will change the entire scheme of thing here.
That is what is being raised at several forums, because we all know that very often platforms do edit content, they block content, they promote content. So they are in many ways no different from what a print media does. It's not that everything that comes on it goes on uninterned. So there is some editing going on. Once it's editing going on, they come into the category of publishers. Having said that, they were given certain exemptions under Section 79 of the IT Act, which required compliance, which gave them some immunity in regard to whatever is being given there. So the government's stand is that once you have certain immunity, then it also stems from the desire or the proof of complying with all the provisions or the guidelines the government has given. So it will depend on how they comply with that, and if they don't comply with what the government has notified, then the exemption immunity that they had, that would also not stand. So that's everything they all understand, and from what I read is that there is no reason they would not comply, and they have been complying with the other orders which the government has passed in the past. So any non-compliance will attract action as per Part 3 of the IT Act. So, but I would still feel that we would not reach such a situation when government needs to take any punitive action. But yes, laws are there. Laws are there to ensure compliance. Laws are to ensure laws are there to ensure constructive and positive uses of platforms. And I'm sure the same will be applicable to these platforms also.
Indeed, laws of the land will have to be followed by everyone, all stakeholders involved here. Nobody is about the law there. Let's talk about the user perspective here as well, Mr. Singh. And then I'm taking it from what Advocate Agarwal also earlier said about how you would agree with that more than anyone, being the CEO of MyGov platform as well as NEGD, that technology, specifically social media platforms, have played a very, very significant role in harnessing knowledge, harnessing talent, as well as connecting people also. But the veracity and the rules and regulations will have to be followed. Now, when we talk about these guidelines which are being put in place and the compliance by these companies, vis-a-vis how it is going to be beneficial for the end user, somebody like me, somebody like Advocate Agarwal, and somebody like you as well. All of us have accounts on these social media platforms.
See, number one, your personal photographs, your personal image is secured, and you will not be shown something which is not which will not come under civilized behavior. Like if your child is there on a social media platform, you would not want your child to be exposed to pornography. You will not ask like your child to be exposed to bullying or violent behavior or anything which is not in the normal sense. So that is something that we all will benefit. Women will be secure from harassment, from people. Very often, people have access to photographs of women and they post it in objectionable manner. So that way, the sensitivity with regard to those issues will be taken care of. The posts which promote hatred, the posts which promote rape, the posts which promote violence, that will be restricted. The posts which promote violence based on religious issues, posts which promote sedition or any kind of violent act against the normal law and order, that will be restricted. Freedom of speech is totally allowed. India is a free country and we are able to voice and even in the preamble to the guidelines, it very clearly says the intent of the guidelines is not to restrict any kind of criticism. India is a democratic country. Everybody is allowed to voice their opinion. We see all the time. But this cannot, the desire for free speech and desire of criticism cannot be taken to extent wherein somebody's life is involved, somebody's dignity is involved, crime is involved. So if it leads to any crime, then that in terms of objectionable. So everything else is very much allowed. And that's why India has been a place where all these platforms have grown immensely. People are using that. But this also means that it has to be regulated. It leads to betterment in the normal life for everyone and doesn't lead to any kind of harassment or bullying or violating the dignity of any individual.
Okay, indeed, definitely. Level playing field and accountability both have to be there, as Mr. Singh is pointing out. Quick concluding comment from you as well, Advocate Agarwal, vis-a-vis the rights and benefits for the users, because ultimately it's about end users. And for the social media platforms as well, their growth depends upon how many people like to use these platforms and how many more will subscribe to them. So if the subscribers, the end users, rights are not taken care of, then obviously they'll not be able to grow in the business sense as well.
You're right, and I think they had been sensitive to these particular suggestions, and a lot of sexually oriented contents, which is definitely objectionable, and which is obviously targeted at children and vulnerable sections of society, that has been removed. And I think YouTube, Google, Twitter, Facebook, they are all very active and they have large teams, I believe, to remove that kind of a content. And that's how a typical common user is actually not complaining that much, except for some things like privacy policy or where their data is being stored and some fake news, which is a false news, which is spreading. So users per se have definitely benefited. And so far, Honorable Supreme Court's action in the Prajula case has also helped the cause of the common persons, and those platforms has really become much better than what they used to be before that particular case and the orders of the Honorable Supreme Court. But in the same line, I still feel that there is a need for us also to have some kind of a law which is going to curb the fake news, which is going to curb the falsehood on the lines of the law which is there in the Singapore and other places. That will make these platforms a perfect place for all sections of the society, younger, older, vulnerable, children, women, and not only from the sexual but from the news exchange perspective also. These platforms are really good. They should work under the government and self-regulatory oversight, but yes, they are really useful and they should be allowed and continue to work.
Okay, so there it is. Thank you so much, Advocate Anuj Agarwal, as well as Mr. Abhishek Singh, for sharing your views and insights on this very important aspect vis-a-vis the social media platforms. That is the new set of rules and regulations, the guidelines specifically, which have been put in place by the government. And as our experts are pointing out, all social media companies will have to adhere to these guidelines, the law of the land therein. We'll come back again tomorrow with a different topic. Till then, keep watching. Thank you.